Okay, wow, it's been a really long time since the last devlog. And well, for this video, I'm here with the last devlog for Pumpice's release. Even though it took almost 2 years to make this game when I wanted to make it in a few months, I did a lot of prioritizing over different things for the game and actually started putting a lot of work into it over this year. So in this devlog, I'm going to be going over pretty much the entire game since it's much different from the last devlog, and I hope you all enjoy how the game turned out since it's finally finished and out. So let's get into it. So coming into 2025, things were apparently rough with Pumpice, since I just kept racking my brain about the best way to downsize the game. Like, I was even thinking last year, would this concept work, maybe this direction, and then I'd step back on it and keep thinking because the other concepts I had in mind were easily twice as big as what the actual game ended up being. So what I ended up doing was constraining the game down into a level format. 4 levels, 4 pumpkins in each one, 4 secret pumpkins, 4 bosses, and a final level with a final boss. Each level would require you to collect as many pumpkins as you want, adjusting the difficulty according to your goal. This was pretty simple since I could still make the game how I'd want, but I'd just be going about the process way faster and focused than I was before, which probably speaks to how unplanned the previous ideas I had in mind for the game were, but with that all laid out, I could finally move on to make the game at a faster pace, which is pretty much the only reason that Pumpice is out right now. Like all games, I needed to make a title screen for Pumpice so that you could get into the game properly and also choose how you wanted to go about the levels, since I wanted you to choose how many pumpkins you want to collect as a part in setting the level difficulty. Besides that, however, the title screen was pretty simple for the most part, with the largest changes occurring with the addition of the settings and instruction menus as development went on. For the level select in particular, I put together a sort of 3D room scene with Lucy lying on the bed with her sleeping before you pick a level, and then when you do pick a level, she wakes up and the level is transitioned into using some randomly changing backgrounds. The interesting part about this room scene is that I initially planned it to be a sort of tutorial for the game's mechanics, when it was going to be more complex and about planting pumpkins against the time. So when it came to the final version of the game, and I had no use for this house model and any other related stuff or concepts, I just went ahead and made what was necessary for a room scene, which you can see that if I go into the actual Godot scene for the room, all the room elements have just been aligned against the camera to look like they're part of the scene, even though they physically aren't. Finally, for some more technical details, the sub viewport nodes in Godot allow me to put what the camera shows next to UI elements, even though the room is a 3D scene. As for the UI and the level select, the controls for the UI stay static, while the preview images for the level are evenly distributed with a parent node moving them and another parent node clipping them. One issue I came across while making the title screen settings was that whenever I would have multiple columns of control nodes next to each other with different Y positions, if you use the keyboard to move your selection down or up, sometimes you would instead select the control node closest to the left or right, which wouldn't be the desired behavior. So to fix this, I had to manually assign the focus neighbors when going in certain directions for some control nodes. And that fixed the issue where Godot's auto neighboring wasn't correct. Also, if you ever wondered how some games auto-select UI elements like the first button for the title screen, that can be done by using a method to grab the focus of, in this case, a control node, so hopefully this helps. Most of the controls have stayed the same since the last devlog, besides a few changes for some new states and abilities that you can use. Lunging, a previous ability, was somewhat fixed to allow you to lunge forward if you aren't pressing any keys, and the state transition for it is always smooth, as that was an issue before. I also removed the nerf that was in place for the state before, where you would have a timer start once the lunge was activated. Since that was annoying when it came to playtesting, it was just an unnecessary limitation. On top of that, lunging was also rebound to a different key and the left mouse button, since it was annoying to activate and layer abilities upon multiple activations of a single key, and because of feedback from a playtester to mimic SRB2 thought controls, which was something I never thought about even though I played that game several times. One new ability added to better control Lucy is flying, and it's kind of an opposite to the lunge. Flying allows you to keep your vertical position for a short amount of time while also moving around slower in the air as well, allowing you to ground yourself really quick when moving too fast. This ability actually got bound to a second activation of the spacebar, since it makes sense for this sort of functionality, but I also bound it to the right mouse as well for the previous design reason I mentioned earlier. Swimming is a simple mechanic I put on top of entering water sources, and there's not much to say here besides the fact that it's just value changes, so that it feels like you're moving in water, with a reduction to velocity when you're not moving in any direction. Moving down in water is bound to left shift, while moving up is bound to spacebar, as per similar control schemes from games like Minecraft. Also, if you're in water while taking any source of damage, damage is actually nullified to provide less punishment for the reduction in speed while in water. But this only serves for recovery, as there are no level design skips that I know of that you can do while in water. As an extension to flying, there's also a sort of similar state for when you touch these upwind sources in the final level, which make you go up with high movement velocity so that you can traverse large gaps. It kind of leaves you vulnerable to some airborne obstacles, but if you know how to take advantage of it, it lets you move very fast and is very important for success in the final level. Finally, there are extra states based off of the swimming state, which can allow you to freely move in air or on a broom with some extra capabilities, but I can't reveal anything about that in this video since it's tied to secret content. You can learn more about it by finding all the secret pumpkins in game. And that's all the controls that are in Pumpice right now. It feels a lot more robust to control Lucy now, and the controls allow for a lot of flexibility in both experienced and new players if they understand how to use the abilities, which is what I intended when adding them to Pumpice. Some interesting things I discovered while playtesting these abilities came through quite a few bugs which had some unintended side effects that were both desirable and undesirable. For example, because the flying mechanic only has a clamp for movement velocity when you press WASD, if you do the lunge beforehand and don't press WASD while in the flying state, you actually retain that movement velocity for the duration you fly, which allows you to move super fast while keeping your vertical position. And while this is very useful and OP, a cool drawback is that if you want to take advantage of this high velocity, you have to give up your control during the duration of your flight, otherwise you'll get hit by the velocity limit and you can't move as fast anymore. Super fun tech for experienced players, which I definitely want to keep in the game. Fun fact though, because I had some specific code to reset flags for lunging and flying inside those states, you could actually chain lunging and flying to infinitely fly with enough practice, which was obviously super broken against level design, so I had to patch it. Although funnily enough, I did use it a lot as an unintended debug feature for exploring levels. For water movement, a similar piece of tech that exists for fast movement is to time your jumps when entering water. Exiting water puts you back into the normal movement states, so if you jump on the surface of the water and time it, you can essentially just move at the same speed as walking on the ground, which is useful for water-heavy levels like the temple. Unintended, but a perfectly natural mechanic for the skill you put into it. As a sort of point about technical design, I mentioned that I use the state machine to separate all these different mechanics so that they don't cause technical issues for me, so that was a very important part when making the controls. However, one thing I do wonder about is if I should have localized certain functions for Lucy to their respective states, since the player script sits at around lines of code right now. My mentality for putting all the functions into the player character was basically like building blocks, where all the functions and variables are blocks and then I put them together in states, which at least makes sense to me, but let me know if this has any issues, maybe for future projects or something. And that's all the stuff that came up when making these controls. Note that there is also complete controller support if you want to play the game with that, and that there is also complete keyboard control if you want to control the camera with the arrow keys, so you can play Pumpice in quite a few ways. One thing I have wondered about doing though is mobile control, so if anyone is interested in that, let me know, as it could come in a 1.1 update to Pumpice. For those of you who watched the previous devlogs, you'll know that I had some pretty weird concepts for gameplay in mind. But for those who didn't, I'll say that those concepts were kind of all over the place, as I didn't even prototype them in the first place. And even though I didn't necessarily make a bare bones prototype in the sense that there are just game mechanics and minimal visuals, the first prototype of Pumpice was really useful in understanding what needed to be added, changed, and removed from the game. One thing you may notice is that Pumpice's levels are very oriented around the use of platforms. They're intended for replacing geometry that would have been upheld from the ground, and I wish that I could have made a prettier solution and not look like Sonic Frontiers, but I had to do it for time's sake, so yeah. Anyways though, if you compare the canyon level from the prototype to the canyon level from the final game, you'll notice that they're pretty much exactly the same level design wise, with only some visual changes here and there. What that meant was that the levels didn't really need to be changed dramatically as development went on, only modifications needed to be made for stuff that surrounded the level, like other objects and mechanics, which was really good since that meant I had to spend way less time tweaking that sort of stuff compared to the rest of the gameplay. Besides that, the gameplay flow that I decided to settle on for the levels is as follows. Before you start a level, you set a goal of how many pumpkins you want to get. However, by increasing this goal, the level difficulty will also increase, giving you a harder time when getting pumpkins and going against the boss. In the level, you can collect pumpkins in any order you want, as you only have to focus on meeting your pumpkin goal. Additionally, if you feel explorative, you can find some secret pumpkins hidden around the level. They aren't too hidden, and there are usually some visual cues to suggest where they may be around the level, but you do have to keep a keen eye out to notice where they might be, as it's not always obvious even if you're explorative. The best way to go about finding these secret pumpkins would be to use Occam's razor, as the location of these pumpkins are pretty simple since they surround notable points of geometry. Regardless though, they still have a good amount of challenge to find them, so I feel I balanced this part of the game relatively well, even though Pumpice isn't necessarily a puzzle game. Anyways, after you've reached your pumpkin goal, a suggestion will be made telling you to check a notable location, usually near the beginning of the level. Once you reach that location, a dialogue with the boss of the level will start, and you have to dodge the boss's attacks to reach the end portal to leave the level with the pumpkins you've collected. And as mentioned earlier, if you set a high pumpkin goal, you'll not only have a harder time reaching the end portal, but you also have less time to do so as well. So you only want to set your pumpkin goal to what you feel like you can accomplish, which I feel is a pretty good way to kind of claim how much skill you have. Once you reach the end portal, an end screen pops up telling you how much pumpkins you earned, with a star signifying you collected the secret pumpkin, and you return to the level select to pick your next level. Note that you can only unlock the next level to the right if you beat the level before it. And well, that's the gameplay flow. It's pretty simple but engaging. Level design wise, I think that if you were to remove all the obstacles and levels, Pumpice would still be an interesting game in the way that you explore the level geometry against the time, but because the obstacles do exist, extra attention is required to prevent setbacks, since getting hurt in Pumpice basically sends you flying in a random direction. Is it fair? I don't know. Well, I never said the game was easy, and I honestly intended Pumpice to be a hard game, so take it as you will, but the obstacles are as follows. Red circles which represent fires, and if you touch them you get hurt. Sheeps are idling dumb creatures that walk around randomly, but don't get too close to them, otherwise they'll chase you down and try to hurt you. And statues are static obstacles that don't do anything if you go fast and run past them, but stay too close and for too long, and they'll hurt you because they didn't like your presence. In the past, I intended to add more unique obstacles per level, like various enemies with interesting behaviors, but I scrapped those ideas since it would have taken way too much effort and time to implement, even with some uniformity through the enemy class. But I'm still happy with how it turned out. I feel like this gameplay is a good demonstration of working under limitations. The only major notable change to level design comes in the final level, where I added checkpoints since the level is super huge with multiple points where you can easily fall off. But I didn't add any checkpoints to other levels since it never made sense considering their free will nature. Despite my previous efforts to make the game stand out with shaders, it would sometimes have some weird interference issues with the camera, and it was also quite visually disrupted, so I just cut them out altogether and kept the game's resolution at QVGA. Besides that, however, I would usually have a pretty unchanging workflow for making models and art for Pumpice, so I'll go through some types of graphics that I made for Pumpice and explain how I would go about them. For models, I would first start by making the mesh, joining related objects together, or start the rigging process instantly, and then parenting objects to bones for posing, similar to the way it used to be done for most N64 games. However, I didn't do this for Lucy's model, and it ended up just being this kind of stretchy mess to work with, but I still think I animated it alright by just using the weird quirks of the model anyways to my advantage. For other models though, besides avoiding those hiccups, I would then do some okay-ish UV unwrapping, and then add textures and vertex painting to models to finish them up for importing to Godot. Inside Godot, some of these models wouldn't have the correct configuration the first time going in, since it would be assumed that you would want all the generic lighting features at first. But after I learned that you can just toggle some stuff like colors on in the blend import settings and even save custom versions of materials and animations, it made in-engine modifications to models way easier than I thought them out to be. So if you need to do similar stuff like this, definitely take this into account. For all the 2D stuff, however, my workflow was all over the place since I just work in whatever software I'd feel like would work well for the time being, since this project traveled like a nomad across all three of the great operating systems. But basically, what I'd go ahead and do is I'd just draw whatever I'd want, maybe add some FX in either Affinity Photo, Designer, Krita, or Photopea, and just export it out as PNGs to use in Godot. I wish I could really explain some of my thought process behind some of these things, but I really can't. It's almost as if all the textures were made on a whim. But if I had to describe a set of textures that I did know the process of, the house cutscene images were all made in Krita with a basic unshaded lineless style, and then I went ahead and added a bunch of FX on top to sort of automatically add detail for more depth and variety. Besides that though, that's all there really was to the textures. As for the particles, however, my workflow would vary. Sometimes I tried to create particles entirely within Godot, like with this rain, which is just the gradients from Godot with some parameter changes, while other times I'd make a small sprite sheet animation and then go in and make the particle material and adjust the settings for it. The best way I could explain making this type of stuff is to just work step by step. Godot has a lot of built-in settings for making particles that should do a lot of stuff, so just mess around until you get what you need. Pumpice's music had a bit of an interesting start, since its first tracks were composed by my friend Waternova. For the day and night tracks in particular, I helped author some of the decisions and composition, so both of our influences can be seen in those tracks. And besides the credits track, which was unrelated and made by my friend Aaron, the rest of the music was composed by me using Reaper, since I became interested in it from a recommendation. For an idea of what my process is like composing music, I have a video from almost last year where I go over all the tracks I made for Vlogtober, but for this video I'll basically just summarize and say that for all the tracks I made by myself, I made them based on the themes I felt the scenarios visually were, along with whatever inspiration I'd get as well. A couple examples of this would be the distant foggy nature of the temple. It feels very isolated and ambient, so I tried to approach that track with some inspiration from Boards of Canada. But for the final boss, who yes, is named Pumpice, I used the harpsichord and bass to set a spooky and dark tone like a Halloween character. So basically, just use whatever you want to convey for feel, since that works to immerse players and make your game bountiful. Sound effects are interesting since I went with a more Foley and vocal approach than I would for other stuff that I've worked on, probably because I just press randomize a bunch of times in C-tone. But seriously though, a good example of my process for sound effects can be seen through the ones I made for Lucy. This was back when I was still using Bitwig, but I also made some sound effects in Reaper as well, although they're undocumented since I never saved the project files for those. In here, you can see all the different sound effects I made have multiple parts to them, with the majority being vocal. Basically, my vocals act as an ambiguous attempt at the sound effect, kind of like a first draft, and then I add effects on top like EQ and certain distortions to sort of double down on that ambiguity and hone it to be more specific. Then after that, I add extra stuff like even other real sound effects or instruments to make it pop out and feel unique. Kind of like a cartoon, but just way more ambiguous. As an extra note, some sound effects were also taken from Freesound and modified, but that wasn't the majority and that was done towards the end of development since I wanted to close development faster. Just know that regardless of your artistic skills, you have options out there and you shouldn't be afraid to use them, especially if they can benefit you for the better. Now, I'm not going to say too much on this part because I'm not a professional and most of this work was just for fun, but yeah, I guess the voice acting is just that. I had some of my friends dabble as well, but I think the most notable part is that because at one point the end of development took place while I was on vacation, I just used my phone mic to do the rest of the voice acting, and that's why you can hear it has a lot of popping. It still turned out good, I think, and all the voice acting is just done for a little humor, so I hope you enjoy it. Saving data was a bit of an issue in playtesting since previously set values would sometimes be unset upon level completion. Why is this? Well, because I never had any conditions to prevent it from happening. If you're ever saving data one way, always add a condition to prevent overwriting that data, even if any other condition should overwrite that data anyways. It helped me fix that issue and actually ensure that the secret stuff for Pumpice works, so if you're ever building a system that saves flag-like data, keep this in mind. Besides that, saving data is pretty much just calling to the config file class to load and save data for files, very simple to use. Pumpice didn't necessarily turn out to be the exact project I wanted, kind of like Run Diggy Run, but it helped me learn so much about working in 3D and I got a lot of opportunities to put my other skills together into a game, so I'm very happy with the results. Time-wise, I'm going to try real hard to never make a game like this again, in the sense that for a small project like this, it shouldn't have taken almost 2 years to make. I have another project I want to finish sitting on the back burner, and I haven't been able to touch it at all since I was working on Pumpice the entire time, so I will definitely schedule and work better to not have that happen again, and the next project I'm finishing is the fan project that I've been working on for a long time. If you're interested in seeing that, stick around because I'll be posting a brief for updates going forward, and more devlogs of course regarding that. Also, since this is another free project, I would like to open source it, but a lot of the project's graphical functionality relies on cache stored in the .godot folder, which is typically supposed to be ignored in Git. Since it's a large folder as well, and I'm not sure if that cache is personalized, I'm not sure if I can open source the project at the moment. I know some people would be fine dealing with a large repo size, so if anyone can confirm that it's safe to include this folder, I'll have no problem open sourcing it for you all to use. Finally, I'd like to thank my friends ACJ, Drake Harris, Aaron, Jeffrey Marks, Kian, Super Dave, and Telemaco for helping playtest and voice act for Pumpice. Without them, Pumpice wouldn't have released as fast considering the situation, and it also wouldn't have been as good of a game without their contributions and feedback. So big thanks to them, and yeah, that's about it. If you're interested in future projects and videos, stick around, and I'll see you all in the next video.